had two things in my mind this week about Epiphany. One was a sentence I read. I thought this was a beautiful sentence. The Magi reveal that our search for meaning, our search for eternal life, concludes in worship. And in fact, that's occasionally you'll see a Christmas card with the kings on their way, but most of the time we see the Magi, or king, whatever, we see the Magi presenting their gifts, doing homage to the newborn King of the Jews. And the second thing I had in my mind that contrasts greatly with that is the dwindling attendance at worship in our churches, and in particular the phrase or the sentence I hear quite often. Either people say it to me, or you parents tell me that your teenagers say it to you. I don't get anything out of the Mass. I don't want to go to the Mass. I don't get anything out of it. I thought today might be a good day to talk a little bit about worship. And first of all, to get an idea of what worship is, that would help us. I've put together kind of a definition that worship is an act of reverence we do to God. And that act of reverence, we do that act of reverence by giving praise and glory and thanksgiving to God. And the word homage comes through the French, comes from the Latin through the French, but in feudal times, it was actually a public ceremony whereby vassals pledged their service to a king or overlord of some way, And so this idea of doing homage is an act of acknowledging God as God, and we as God's servants. And included in that is giving glory and praise to God, giving thanks to God, and usually following the Jewish tradition, we give thanks to God by recounting the good deeds, the great deeds of the Lord. And so we do that, of course, in the preface and in the Eucharistic prayer, where we talk about what God has done for us, how God has sent His Son to us and redeemed us. That's our biggest story, you might say, among all the stories we might say of God. And we give praise and then an offering to God. Usually worship includes some sacrifice or other offering, gifts we bring. And of course, the sacrifice we make, that we offer to God, is Christ's sacrifice on the cross. But we bring our gifts, other gifts too, and attach them to that. Important question, really, one important question is, why do we worship? And I remember in seminary when I was first told that worship is an act of justice. In other words, God deserves our worship because God is God. And you guys can probably say this along with me. You've heard this 1,000 times probably, right? It is truly right and just, our duty and our salvation, right? Always and everywhere to give you thanks. We say those literal words at many Masses and some version of it at every Mass, right? It's truly right that we worship God and give God thanks because who God is and what God has done for us. It's a duty of those created by God. and it's just. It's only what God deserves, right? So the first thing I would say, and I do say to people who say that phrase to me, I don't get anything out of the Mass. The first thing you can answer to your teenagers or whoever says it to you is, we don't come to Mass primarily to get something. We come to Mass primarily to worship, to give something to God. And we see the Magi. They come to give homage, and they come to bring their gifts. And that's the first thing to notice about worship. And it's the first thing to say. If you come here first expecting that you're going to get something, you've come with the wrong mindset. You come to give something. But we do receive something at worship, right? I mean, there's no doubt. That is, and what we receive is not incidental. In other words, it's not unimportant, and it's not accidental. God intended for us to receive. What we receive is grace. The grace of salvation. The grace of, and if you listen to the prayers closely in the Mass, you'll hear all these things. I was going to read all them to you, and I was afraid it would become too academic, But we receive the grace of salvation. We receive the grace of being transformed into a unified body. We receive a lot of graces. But what we receive, and here's the problem, I think, for people who grow up in our society now, what we receive is, first of all, not material. We're a very material society. We're a very, and we're material beings, So it's easy to get caught up in that. But what we receive is not material, and what we receive is not really emotionally satisfying, which is another big value of our society. And so we actually have to teach ourselves, I'm supposed to be teaching you, you're supposed to be teaching your children, We have to teach ourselves that there are more important and more valuable things in the world than just material things, just what brings us some kind of emotional happiness. Jesus says in John's Gospel, "Truly, truly, I tell you, unless you eat of the flesh of the Son of Man and drink his blood, you shall not have life within you." And so this life we can't see and touch and taste, but this life is eternal life that we receive in the process of our worship. And so the second thing I say to people who say to me they don't get anything out of the Mass, and the second thing you should say to your teenagers or whoever else says it to you, is that you're incorrect. That's not true that you don't get anything out of the Mass. You get more than you could ever imagine out of the Mass. You get more out of the Mass than you can get anywhere else. You just have to be taught to see it and understand it and appreciate it. And so, as we look at the Magi, on their knees before Jesus, the baby, offering their gifts, it's good to remind ourselves of this. This is worship. Worship is primarily giving. And it's giving to God what God deserves to be given. And it's good for us to give it, because secondarily, we do receive when we worship. We receive spiritual gift beyond anything we can imagine. We receive the spiritual gifts that will bring us to eternal life.